Hey,
Awesome.
thanks, Michael. So, everyone, this is Michael Cowling from CQU, who's going to be presenting today. And I'm going to pass over to Michael to introduce himself and to share his interest in Gen AI and his 10, what is it, 10 ways of using Gen AI?
Top 10 ways to use Gen AI in your academic
That's it.
life.
Love it.
So,
Off you go. Thanks, Michael.
no problem at all. Thanks so much for the introduction, Trixie. And yes, I love that you say Michael will introduce himself. If you've watched a few of my presentations before, you know that I'm not afraid to introduce myself. So let me hit me the share button for you, ladies and gentlemen, and then I'll tell you a little bit of about how this all works. And I've got to do the quick Zoom shuffle so that I can see everybody on the screen again. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slides. So, this is a bit of a journey for me. I mean, I think it's reasonable to suggest that I've kind of been on a Gen AI journey for the last 24 months. Believe it or not, it's only been 24 months since ChatGPT came out, November 2022, right? And I think it's made a pretty transformative change to our sector. And if I get a chance, I'll share with you a curve that I often use to describe this called the Gartner hype cycle. Otherwise, I'll link you towards a couple of presentations of mine, maybe at the end, that you can go and watch me talk a little bit more about generative AI. But the journey really for me was understanding how this works and how it fits into technology enhanced learning and to what we're doing in the university sector, and then understanding how people are using it, and finally getting to a point where I can give some advice on how you might use it. And so this set of slides I presented only a few weeks ago at the HE Fest, which was running in Adelaide at the University of South Australia, organised by Future Campus. Some of you might know Future Campus. They do sort of a newsletter for academics. It used to be Campus Morning Mail. Now it's Future Campus. And it's sort of inside baseball, insider news for us in the higher education sector. And so I presented at HE Fest via Zoom this presentation. It was the first time ever that I'd actually sort of sat down and said, well, what are top 10, what are some tips? What are some tips? What are some things that you can do with this particular tool? And I've hesitated to do it because I think we needed to learn where we were with this tool. We needed to kind of explore the boundaries and work out what it was good for and what it was not so good for, right, before we kind of moved towards this. But I think with 18, by the time when I presented 18 months, now 24 months under our belt, I think we're in a situation where we can start to talk about these kinds of things. But as Trixie said, she's very confident that Michael will introduce himself. So the obligatory "Who are you?" slide. Why do I get invited to do these kinds of things? It's usually for one of two reasons, and these reasons change all of the time. But it's either because of my teaching award from 2020. I won the AAUT Universities Australia Award for Teaching Excellence in Physical Sciences and Related Studies. And a couple of you might have heard me say before, last time they ever awarded it, because then they changed the names of all the categories. So officially, yes, this is the last time they ever awarded it. But I'm also the president of Askellite, and Askellite is Australia's premier technology enhanced learning society. It's been around for 40 years. I'm the current president. I'm about halfway through my first term as president, and previously was vice president and a member of the executive. And that's because I'm into educational technology. I'm into technology enhanced learning. How can technology change our classroom experience? But my PhD is actually in signal processing and neural networks, basically artificial intelligence. And so it's really interesting that in the last couple of years, people have started to say to me, hey, how are we going to use AI in educational technology? Because finally, after 20 odd years, finally, these things are coming back together. And I'm able to say, well, actually, I'm an AI expert, kind of, sort of, if you cast your mind backwards. And I'm into technology enhanced learning. So I get to weave those two things together finally. But if you want to know more about what I do, go to easiest way is go to www.michaelacowling.com. And as Trixie said, click on LinkedIn. It's probably the place that I share things most, but you'll also find the Create Lab and various other links to projects that I'm doing and things like that and all of that stuff. So there's the obligatory "Who are you?" slide. So my main task today is to give you 10 tips, right? I'm going to give you those top 10 tips on using AI in your academic life. But there's one thing that I want to note for you. But there's really one thing, maybe two things that I want to note for you before I get into that. And the first is that early on, and sort of you can see the dates on these two papers. This one here was January. I think I might have cut the date off of this one, but I think it was around about June. I don't know if anyone can spot whether I think it was down the bottom and I cut it off. So in the early days, in particular, this is January 23. Remember that I told you that ChatGPT came out and was really released to the public in November 22. Some people sort of went, oh, well, this tool's going to change the world so much so that we're going to have to give it credit for things. And so a couple of people early on did things like crediting it as a co-author, right? So you can see here ChatGPT is a co-author of this paper. And similarly, people used the tool to generate stuff and didn't really sort of check the stuff that they were generating before they put it in a paper. And you can see that in this one on the right-hand side, because this first sentence, certainly here is a possible introduction for your topic, is clearly the first sentence that ChatGPT says before it actually gives you the introduction, right? And so these authors, and both of these are Elsevier for some reason, I don't know why, kind of went through this process early on, and fairly early on the journals went, no, guys, this is not going to work. This tool has some limitations, and we're talking about whether or not an AI can be a co-author and things like that is probably a little bit highfalutin. For now, we're going to say don't make it a co-author and make sure that the stuff that you generate with it is checked before you actually spit out the final result. And so my first cautionary note to you is everything that's produced by these tools needs to be checked, right? It's really, really important ultimately that we don't treat it as a final product. We just treat it as kind of a tool to help us think about things. And so all of my tips are related to that. And that's because ultimately this thing is a persuasion machine, not a truth machine. And this is where I could spend ages, if you wanted me to, talking to you about why it's a persuasion machine, why it does what it does, why it's different than the previous AIs that I explored when I was doing my PhD. And the previous AIs I explored were all working with facts. They would take those facts and they would crunch through them and they'd recognize patterns and they'd make predictions. And sometimes those predictions were wrong, but generally they were based on the truth, right? What generative AI does, and not just ChatGPT, but any generative AI, it takes all of that data, it slurps in all of that data from Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or web pages or whatever, and then it uses that data to generate something that sounds good, right? So it's not about necessarily telling you the truth, but giving you something that sounds like it is believable. And so when we end up with these tools producing hallucinations, it's because they don't know what the truth is. All they've got to go on is all the data that they've slurped in. And so that data that they've slurped in is informing what they tell you. And so when ChatGPT tells you that 4 of the 5 best prime ministers in Australia were Labor prime ministers, which is one of the things that caused a bit of an issue a few months ago, it's because of the data it's using to generate that, right? For whatever reason, there's more data out there that says Labor versus Liberal prime ministers are good prime ministers. May be true, maybe not, who knows, right? Depending on which side of the fence you're on. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's full of crap, right? And so you need to be very conscious of evaluating what it says. And it's why ultimately when we talk to our students, we can kind of encourage them to use it as a brainstorming tool, but we probably shouldn't encourage them to use it to generate that final product. And it's why anything that you do across any of these things I tell you, you should evaluate what it says, right? I go into that in a bit more detail in the HE Fest, not HE Fest, the National Symposium in Higher Education presentation I did. So I'm happy to share that with you if you're interested. But the point really is just to not believe what it says. And if you want to know more about how this works, if you want to know more about all these terms, which like BP is back propagation neural networks, or nearest neighbor classification, or self-organizing maps, or k-nearest neighbor, all of the mechanics of how this stuff works, and then how it works in the context of ChatGPT. I'm going to point you towards this article by Stephen Wolfram. He wrote a really detailed article about what ChatGPT is doing and how it works. Probably does a much better job explaining it than I do. Stephen Wolfram, of course, is famous for having created Mathematica, and also Wolfram Alpha as well. But anyway, you're here to get some tips, right? So here's these top 10 ways, top 10 tips on how you can use generative AI in your academic life. And the first one is a bit controversial. I'm going to start with the controversial one, right? Which was controversial on the LinkedIn post that Trixie saw as well. A couple of people said, "Oh, are you sure that's true?" Pastoral care. Now, immediately you're looking at me and going, "Don't be ridiculous, Michael." Right? Don't be ridiculous. A machine cannot replace a human being in terms of making our students feel better. Right? And I've had those conversations with students for years. It's something I talk about in my class often, right? You know, can robots replace human beings for emotional connections? And the answer is, yeah, there's limitations. But even when we talk about robots previously, sometimes robots have been good at providing distraction, or even providing a sort of a simulation of care that is enough for people. My parents would have called it a Clayton's relationship, right? I don't know if anyone knows Clayton, pretty old fashioned these days, right? Clayton's was the drink that wasn't alcoholic. So when you didn't want something alcoholic, you'd have a Clayton's. So it's not real, right? And pastoral care is a bit the same way when it comes to these generative AIs, right? My PhD student a couple of years ago did this graph. He calls it the spectrum of AI teacher tasks. His name's Josiah Coe. The reference is down the bottom there. It's actually pretty small, but you can look it up. It was a paper in Ascolite's conference proceedings in 2022. And he put pastoral care way over here on the right-hand side. He said this needs to be done by the teacher, just like creative tasks or inspirational tasks, which GenAI can't do because it, as I said earlier, it slurps in a bunch of existing data to kind of remix things. So it's got no creativity, no inspiration, but is pretty good at procedural and knowledge recall tasks. So he put pastoral care all the way over here. But I think if I went back to Josiah now in 2024 and talked to him, I'd say to him, maybe it doesn't belong there, right? Because since then, I did a study with these guys, Joey Crawford, Kellyanne Allen, and Bianca Pani, where we investigated how people felt about these tools. And you can look this paper up. It's actually published in this journal, the Studies in Higher Education. And in SIHE, we talked about this study where we went out to people and we asked them how they felt about interacting with AI. And the answer was, we don't mind it as long as we don't need a sense of belonging at the end. And so in other words, this is a really, really good tool to chat to make you feel a little bit less lonely, as long as you don't expect it to have a really, really diehard opinion about whether it's a Collingwood fan or a Carlton fan, right? It's not going to do that. It can't get into those actual discussions with you, but it can talk to you about Carlton and how they're the greatest team and all of the players and all of those things. And that might make you feel better, right? It might make you feel a little bit less lonely. And so it is actually quite a useful tool in that regard. And again, we've seen that happen with robots already, with robots in nursing homes and people working with robots when they're sick in order to distract them. And so it's not surprising, but again, it's just about understanding that limitation. And so that's my first one, right? Pastoral care. It's an interesting way to give students something to talk to and ask it some questions, as long as you encourage them to evaluate the output, right? Because note here, I'm talking much more about pastoral care, about making them feel better than about giving them facts, because the facts could be crap, right? So just bear that in mind. Number 2 is brainstorming. In the early days of learning and teaching, which is really where this kind of shook things up in higher education, lots of academics started to think about models for thinking about how we might use this tool in the classroom. First, we tried to ban it, and then we kind of worked out that that didn't work, right? We couldn't ban this tool. It was too difficult to ban the tool. The horse had bolted, right? And so instead, we kind of started to come up with models for how we might use the tool in the classroom. And one of the most popular models, I'd argue probably the most popular model for this, is this one here. It's the AI assessment scale. And the AI assessment scale was developed by Mike Perkins and Leon Furs and some other co-authors, but it's mainly Mike and Leon that kind of push it. And it details how you might use AI in your classroom, going all the way from no AI at the top to full AI and AI exploration at the bottom. And we've since seen other universities adopt this kind of model. University of Sydney, for example, they have 2 lanes, right? They either, Uni Sydney say you either have no AI, which they call lane 1, or you have full AI, which you call lane 2, right? So Danny Liu at University of Sydney, he's like, well, we either ban it entirely or we let them use it for whatever they want to use it for. But Mike Perkins and Leon Furs, they said, well, maybe there's something in between, right? Maybe we can encourage students to use this tool for planning and for collaboration, recognizing once again that once you get the results out of this tool, you're going to have to check them before you actually submit them, right? And I think I'm starting to see this rhetoric become really common. I even had a reviewer review something recently and say, whilst it's okay to use GenAI to brainstorm, don't use it for the final product, right? So it's becoming a thing. If you want to ask it to help you plan, if you want to ask it to help you collaborate with people, generate, if you look at the list here, idea generation, drafting, feedback, refinement, it's actually pretty good at that. And that's why we do things like type in a paragraph and say, shorten this for me or summarize this down to points, right? It's good at doing those kinds of things, as long as, again, you check the output from it. And once again, if you want to know, there's a whole bunch of other models that I can introduce you to. This one is probably the most popular. Jason Lodge, who's at the University of Queensland, is doing lots of work in this space with Texa as well. So I'd point you towards a couple of his pubs. He's done 2 with Texa. And then there's a few different universities around Australia that are doing some work in this space as well. And they all come up with different numbers of stuff in this, you say Uni Sydney's got 2, University of New South Wales, Alex Steele was proud to tell me, we've got 6, like more was better, right? So, you know, but this gives you an idea of something we might want to use it for. Number 3, which I guess kind of relates to that, is that I think as we've started to use this tool a little bit more, a lot of these organizations have started to go, well, actually, what this tool is really good at is rewriting stuff for you, right? And so, again, you feed in a paragraph and say, rewrite this. And in the early days, we did it in a silly way. We would say, rewrite this in the tone of Shakespeare, or rewrite this in the tone of Edgar Allan Poe, or, you know, like a pirate or something, right? That's what we would do. But the reality is that what we're actually probably more likely to do in a professional context is say, hey, can you take this and can you rewrite it in a friendly tone or a professional tone or a concise tone, right? Or can you summarize this, or can you give us the key points, right? And it's actually pretty good at that. Again, check the output, make sure you're happy with what it produces. But for us as academics, a really good way to draft emails to students and to do some of that more administrative work that we're doing. It's really good. You ask it for a 50-word or 100-word email back to a student about assessment or about their assignment being late or about something in particular. And it's good at that. If you give it some points, it's good at inserting the right kind of flowery language to make it sound nice. And again, you probably need to read it afterwards, but if you do that, then you can save yourself some time. And it's built into various tools these days. So Apple just introduced this. They call it Apple Intelligence. Now you can highlight any paragraph and ask it to do this. This is a screenshot of Apple Intelligence. But of course, you can also do it using ChatGPT. Just go to ChatGPT and ask it to write something for you. Or if your institution uses Copilot, then you can do it with Copilot as well. And I think Microsoft is talking about, if not already doing it, shortly building it into some of their Office tools as well, like Word and Outlook and things like that. So good at rewriting. It's also really, really good at summarizing. And this is something that we need lots as academics, right? This is something that we spend a lot of time doing. Inevitably, you get a grant application, right? Or a conference abstract submission. And they say to you, you're allowed 50 words or you're allowed 100 words or whatever. And you're like, oh, okay, let me work out 100 words. Or maybe you don't know what those 100 words should be. And so you sort of go to it, hey, can you write me 100 words on this? Right? Our grants office hates it when I say it, but it's really good for writing the stuff about sustainability in a grant application, or, what else do they sometimes ask about in there? Dissemination, right? It's a good starter. And then you can kind of adjust it as you go along. And so there's a gag. I love this gag about the flight attendant and is there a doctor on board? Right. I think that's lots of fun. But the idea here is that it will do that for you. It'll summarize things for you. And I've seen academics use it often to summarize research articles for them as well. So one of my recent PhD students said he was using it a lot for lit review. Now, again, you need to be really careful with this because it's full of crap, right? So be very conscious of if it tells you these are the methods that are used or the results that are used. Is that true? Don't rely on it. But if you just need to write a couple of sentences, to put in your endnote, in your notes, in your endnote, then sort of getting it to write it and then checking it against the paper is probably still quicker than writing it yourself, right? So that summary can be useful for us. And again, ChatGPT is good at this. There are lots of other tools that do it as well. You'll also encounter there are tools out there that promise to do more for you, like a whole lit review or synthesizing a whole bunch of papers. I'd caution you to be a little bit careful with those tools because of hallucinations. So be very conscious about that. So Elicit is an example of one of those tools. I'm not saying it's broken, but I am saying you probably need to check the output. And in particular, you need to check the references to make sure that they're actually true. People don't realize that ChatGPT actually generates fake references, right? So it'll take the DOI of one thing and the title of something else and the authors of something else, will glue them together. It looks like a good reference, but if you look it up on Google Scholar, it doesn't actually exist, right? And once you understand how the tool works, it's doing that because it thinks that's what you want to hear, right? Even though it's not true. So just bear that in mind. Something that I encourage people to do with the tool from the very, very beginning is to generate rubrics. I'm an academic, right? I've spent a lot of time teaching. I struggle to get the words right in a rubric. And you inevitably, at least I tend to find an existing rubric and just kind of tweak it, right? You've got a whole bunch of them, you kind of glue them together, right? So ChatGPT is really good at that. And if you go to it and ask it to do a rubric for you, so this one is me cheating and going and asking it to generate a rubric for assessing student ethics, which is a unit that I teach in our IT program. It spits out this awesome thing with all of these columns and all of these rows filled in, and it looks really, really good. Again, you got to look through it, make sure it's what you actually want to assess with your students, but it saves you a whole bunch of time in generating those rubrics. Number 6 is data analysis. This one's an interesting one, right? Because you look at me and you immediately say to me, but Michael, you said that it's full of crap. How can I trust the data analysis that it does? And the answer is that what it's doing here is it's using your data as a source for working out what's common in that data, the frequency of the data, what concepts kind of come up over and over again. And because it's good at understanding, different words that mean the same thing, it can sort of identify a bit of nuance that maybe just a statistical analysis wouldn't identify, right? So it's quite good at that, as long as you, again, make sure that you check the output, right? So you got to check, if it's giving you quotes, are they real quotes, right? If it says that this term is used a lot, we'll do a bit of a spot check to make sure that it actually is being used. But because in this situation, it's kind of using the data that you feed into it as input, you're getting it to sort through that data. And if you go to ChatGPT and you have a look on their website, they've now got these things called GPTs, small GPTs, right? Or small language models. And a GPT is a thing that you can train with just the data you want it to analyze. And there are a lot of people that have trained GPTs on existing data sets, because if you put the data in, you know what it's being fed, so you know it's going to hallucinate less, right? And so you might look at those custom GPTs and see if they maybe suit you better for this. But this tool here, Leximancer, which I found on the web, is also another tool that promises to do this kind of data analysis for you. A couple of things you need to note, though, if you do use it for data analysis. Number one is it can't generate emerging concepts, emergent themes, right? If that's not something that people have talked about in the past, right? Because it doesn't generate new stuff, right? So if it's brand new, if it takes that nuance and that discerning view that you've got as a qualitative researcher in order to get that theme out, it's not going to give you that theme, right? It's really only going to kind of give you the remixed stuff, the remixed obvious stuff, if you understand what I mean. And the other thing which makes all of the research ethics guys in the room collapse is that you've got to remember that when you put your data into this tool, you are feeding the data to the tool, and then it's using that data to generate other responses for people later on. And so if you want to keep your data private, do not put it into ChatGPT or one of these other tools. And in particular, OpenAI, who make ChatGPT, their privacy policies are pants, right? They're terrible, right? They very much have said, hey, look, guys, if you give us the data, then we're using the data, right? And even Apple, who has a reputation for privacy, got in trouble with Apple Intelligence for scraping data off the web to train Apple Intelligence without asking people's permission. And Apple is famously very strict about privacy. So these tools, they very much rely on data. And so if you give them some data, they're going to use it. So just bear that in mind. And that may mean that data analysis with this tool for you is a non-starter. If you ring your ethics office and the ethics officer collapses and you have to go check on them, then it's probably not a good idea to do data analysis with these tools. But maybe Copilot or some other tool has got different policies, and you can work out how to do it. Number 7 is feedback. This is a relatively early tool, but is really, really popular amongst institutions because I think it really satisfies a need that we have as academics, which is producing good quality feedback. How many times do you say the same thing to your students, right? How many times do you go, oh, another one that didn't put enough references in, or another one that doesn't know what the heck an executive summary is? And some of us, we keep sort of a corpus of comments we can copy and paste in as feedback, but then inevitably you get a student that compares with their friend and goes, well, he wrote the same comment. Clearly he didn't read this as I did. You just both made the same mistake, right? And so this tool is really good at generating comments. It's called Cogniti, and it actually generates an AI agent that can take your comments, your rough feedback, like, gosh darn it, they don't have any references, and turn it into something that says, wouldn't it would be nice here if you included more references, here's some examples, or here's a good way to think about that, or blah, 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 right? Awesome tool used by thousands of universities across the world, actually developed at the University of Sydney down in down south from where we are, by Danny Liu, who I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, and a whole bunch of people at the University of Sydney. Free to use, and you can even get the code base and customize it for your own institution if you want to as well. Can't speak highly enough of Cogniti. I think it solves a real need that we have in the institution. Number 8 is engagement. I think when people kind of panicked, there were a couple of different types of people that panicked when ChatGPT came out. Number one is educators like us. Oh my goodness, students are going to use it to write a 1,500-word essay and not be involved. And you know, fair enough, right? But I think the other people that panicked were marketing guys, because marketing people and social media people went, well, my whole job is crafting words that sound cool, right? And so these tools are very good at crafting words that sound cool, and actually really, really good at generating social media content for you as well. And you've seen since then, Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn integrate it into the tool. So if you go to Facebook now and try and post a status update, it'll say, hey, do you want to write this with AI? And it'll ask you to give it some tips, and then it'll write the 50 words or whatever it is for that social media post, right? So I would encourage you to lean into that, right? One of the benefits of that is that we're less worried about the truthfulness, right? You've got to do some basic fact checking, but there's always been a certain amount of spin in marketing, right? Floweriness in the way that people talk. And so I think generating content, particularly social media content with these tools, is really, really useful. Really, really good way for us to get things out into the world. And I'm a big advocate, you might have heard me say this before, of getting down out of the ivory tower. I think as academics, it's really important for us not only to do the work, but to share it with the world. And I think doing this is a really good way to do it. A colleague many, many years ago told me to be bold or impolite. I can't remember what he said, but basically the idea is share these things with people. I know you might feel embarrassed, but it does help to increase your impact and to let people know what you're doing, because how do they know if you don't tell them? So I'd encourage you to do it with this tool. It's really good at doing those kinds of things. Number 9 is reference letters. It's really good at writing reference letters. How often do you get a PhD student or a former student of yours email you and say, hey, can you write me a reference letter? Or, hey, can you fill out this little form? I'm going for a job. It's really good at doing those things, right? Especially if you give it a few bullets about, you know, how they're punctual or on time or whatever. Again, when I do this, I tend to go and dig up a previous letter that I've written and write that about John instead of Mary, right? Change a few names, adjust a few things, maybe go, oh, that's probably not true about John, and I delete that sentence, right? So, you know, these tools give you a really good start for that. Right, they make it really easy for you to write those kinds of reference letters if you want to. And then number 10 is presentations. I don't know if you realize it, but this is my top 10 ways, right? It is based on David Letterman did a top 10 list, right? That's where it all starts, him reading that top 10 list. If I close my eyes, I can still imagine him reading the top 10 list on The Late Show with David Letterman. And so I went to ChatGPT and I said, generate me a picture of a late night host presenting a top 10 list on a late night TV show, kind of in the style of David Letterman. It came back and said, you're not allowed to ask for real people. I said, kind of in the style of an older white guy with a beard, right? And that's what we ended up with, right? I think it's an interesting combination of kind of me a little bit and kind of David Letterman a little bit as well. But it took me all of 3 minutes to generate that particular image. And so as you look through these slides, there's not so many in these slides, but in lots of my slides, there is a lot of AI generated stuff, right? And some people, they'll reference those images, they'll put down the bottom the prompt that they use to generate it. And if you're worried about sourcing, feel free to do that. And you can have a whole conversation with librarians about attributing ChatGPT content as well if you want to. But I think just in terms of illustrating what we're doing, it's awesome, right? And in fact, the reason I'm sitting in front of you here is I then took this image and then I fed this image into Canva, asked Canva to generate a nice little thing for me with AI, and then put these 10 items in that image and shared it on LinkedIn. And then Trixie saw it and went, Michael, you should come and talk about this at the special interest group. And so it is really good at generating that kind of content. And I suspect, as Trixie said when she showed you that poster before we started recording, that there are several elements of that were probably generated with AI as well. So that gets me to my 10 tips, right? So hopefully that gives you 10 ideas of things that you might think about doing. And if you want to know more about how to do any of these things, so if any of those appealed to you and you want to know more about tools, I gave you some examples of tools as we went along, but I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you about that as well. One more thing before I go. I'm a big proponent of this model, right, which is the design thinking model. And I use it in research. In research, it's called design-based research, right? But more broadly, we often refer to it as design thinking, right? And design thinking is really popular in IT and computing because computing is an iterative process, right? So you come up with an idea, you frame a question, you gather a set of inspiration, you generate some ideas, you make those ideas tangible, you do some testing, and then importantly, if it doesn't work, you loop back around and try it again, right? And so things don't always work right the first time, and that's true with generative AI. Some of the things you try are going to be a disaster. But my encouragement here, and the reason I'm putting up the slide, is to encourage you to try a whole bunch of things and see what sticks. Some of them will work, some of them won't. Sometimes you'll try it with one tool and it won't work. Try it with something else. It's something we've been doing in technology for a long time, right? It's very much design thinking, and this process is very much a part of technology. I think now that you're all using ChatGPT, I think it's a good opportunity to encourage you to use this model in what you're doing as well. So that gets me to the end. So any questions would be my thing, but before I do that, I'm going to mention that I also generated this image with ChatGPT. I said I wanted a guy, a thoughtful guy with a beard that was looking kind of like he wanted questions. I think he kind of looks angry. I don't know that it did that well with that one, but you know, you can't win them all. Maybe I'll try again next time. Thanks for that, Trixie. Happy to field any questions, ladies and gentlemen. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes, I think.
Perfect. Yes, I'd love to open it up to the floor and have people ask questions. Wait and see if anything goes.
I'll jump in.
Great.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for that. Gabby and I have been having a conversation as you've been presenting, and you know, we're familiar with, I think, all of those tools, and we've been to Danny's presentations about Cogniti and really interested in it. And you know, we're thinking really carefully about how we prepare our students who are going on to various disciplines. And you know, in our university, they're going from our enabling course. They could be heading into any area. And as you know, some areas are really enthusiastically integrating Gen AI into their curriculum. Others are still resistant and thinking that it's going to be the end of the world, and therefore they're still trying to ban it, or you know, tell students you can't use it. And you know, we said that in the unit profile, you can't use it. So and Darren, who's on screen there, and Rena have done a great job producing some materials for students, and we're telling students that how they can use it. But we're with the caution that, you know, check with your unit coordinator because they may not be so enthusiastic. But if we tell our students all of these things, and I think we should, and it's incumbent upon us to do so, what then happens when they go into those areas where there is that that high level of resistance to the adoption of Gen AI.
They get in trouble. Totally. Look, I think you've nailed it. I think it's about coaching them on those core concepts of what the tool's good for. And that's why I start, right, often these days by saying to people, this is what the tool's good for, but this is what the tool's not so good for. Right. Understanding, oh, there we go, we've got balloons. Understanding where it has its limitations is really important for our students. And in doing so, hopefully we can encourage them not to use it for those things. It's a bit like when you teach a student, mathematics, and you say to them, it's all well and good for you to just bung a bunch of stuff into a formula and get a result, but you need to understand which formula is the right formula to actually use before you start, right? It's the same thing here. We're letting them know that this tool is got these great qualities, but these are the limitations of the tool. I think ultimately, Chris, everybody's going to accept that it's out there in the world, right? And we're going to come up with mechanisms to limit it in some situations, but generally we're going to have to accept that most students are using it. Most professionals are using it for most things where they can. So to give you an idea, our friend Danny Liu, he used to have a model where he said there's some of this stuff in the middle and we're going to put it in the course profile that you can only use it for brainstorming, you can only use it for planning. He tried that for about a year and then he eventually went, this is not working. I can't police what the students do with this tool outside of an invigilated room. So what we're going to say is we either invigilate what they're doing and stop them from using the tool by sticking them in a room and getting them away from computers, or we accept the fact that they're going to use it for whatever they can use it for. So it's a hard one though.
Thanks.
Well, I've got a question, Trixie, if that's all right.
Go.
Thanks, Michael. I was really interested that you started with the pastoral care aspect, and this has been something that's been at the forefront of my mind lately, learning that mental health issues with students has a seismic impact on attrition. And my favorite large language model is Pi, which is an empath model. And pretty much every time I'm on it, it runs things down the side about meditation, breathing techniques, those sorts of things. So I feel like there is an extraordinary untapped medium here for students to have a platform that they can converse with and find out techniques, say to it, I'm having a bad day, what might I be able to do? And I think that I get that there's limitations, but I think, wow, what a thing that every student has at their fingertips. And my point that I find jarring is that we as academics, and I'm speaking broadly here, we often talk about large language models and AI as being crap. These are the terms that we use. You can't trust it, spits out rubbish, don't trust it, etc., etc., etc. And I wonder whether students are not trusting it. And I said it on another presentation quite recently. They said students don't trust it. And I think, well, heck, aren't we peddling that narrative to them wildly everywhere? And I think maybe we need to cultivate better language around this so students can tap it for the mental health aspect. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on that. Michael, thank you.
Look, I always fight against the fear of technology, and it's an interesting comment. I'm so adamant about making, because so many people don't realize where the hallucinations come from, and so I'm so adamant about saying to people it's full of rubbish, because I worry that people trust it too much, right? But you're right, we do have a fear of technology, and we have a general distrust of technology as well. And so I think finding that balance is really important. And I've always, for 20 years, I've been advocating to remove that fear of technology. But I also want people to understand what they can use the model for. It's interesting when you talk about students communicating with it, because of course the thing that we often fall into is worrying about how people will overuse this tool, or will start using this tool and depending on this tool. And I think that's something that's the flip side of what you're saying, where we start to say, well, what about if they start to talk to it and they build up a relationship with it and a friendship with it and they become dependent on it? And I see a lot of dystopian fiction where people worry that that's ultimately what's going to happen. So I'm not sure how to thread that needle, Rena.
Yeah,
between
no, I appreciate that. I've jotted down some notes, and I think, isn't it interesting though, because I would say in the safety of this group that pastoral care is really wanting.
Yes.
Us in the School of Access Education, we spend most of our time in pastoral care, but we are hitting a tiny percentage. And I think if there is some pastoral care that all students can tap into, by heck, that would be a marvelous thing.
Hey, and look, I had a conversation. I know I see Darren's got a question. I had a conversation with a radio host when that study that I showed you first came out, and he was a naysayer when I first rang him. He said, "No, this is crap. We should not talk to these machines." And in the 10 minutes that I spoke to him, his name was Meech. I said, well, what about your grandmother who's in the nursing home who just wants somebody to talk to? What about all of these situations where it's better than nothing? And I genuinely felt that over the course of the 10 minutes, I swayed this guy across to that idea that you're suggesting, that there's value in these tools. We just need to be careful. But let's, Darren.
Hi there, Michael. Thanks for the presentation today. So just to continue on that point of pastoral care, and again what Rena was saying there, I think as well. I think we really need philosophical frameworks that we can use to explain how to engage with these. And I think that's where there's a lot of cases where we've got people who understand how it works, how generative AI works and what it does. But I think the philosophical aspects of what using this technology means is really lacking. I think that's really where the direction of the conversation needs to go. So I think I agree with you. I think it's great that you could use it for pastoral care, but there's a kind of contradiction in terms there. 1 minute we're saying, don't trust it. It's full of nonsense. But then why should we trust it for mental health purposes? Won't it give us nonsense if it's the same? If we're asking it, oh yeah, I'm really depressed, what should I do? Will it say kill yourself, or there's a train station down the road, why do you throw yourself in front of it, or something like that? So I agree, it's great that it can be used for pastoral care, but at the same time, I'm just thinking of the direction that all universities seem to be going in. I had a conversation just yesterday in the Sydney campus about how all the course materials is going online. And apparently this is what students want, but I don't meet any student that tells me this is what they want. So, and I know this is happening in Sydney Uni. A colleague just told me the same thing. So I'm not really sure where my point is going, but I think there's a real kind of, I think we all know how the technology works. We all know what it can do and what it can't do. But I think we really need to frame it within a new philosophical approach as to how we're going to use this, and think about really deeply about where it's going and what we're going to use it for, and how we're going to integrate it into every aspect of our lives, because that's basically what's going to happen in the next 5 or 6 years, or perhaps even quicker.
That's it. Look, I 100% agree. And I think, and look, as a technology person, why I hesitated to do tips for a long time is because I would come to these presentations where somebody would run through a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, you can try this, you can try, and I'd be like, that it's just overwhelming, right? And so I tried to boil mine down to just these 10 things. But I think you're right. I think once we get past working out what the technology does and some of those core ideas, understanding that philosophical view is really important. When I went to the Higher Education Summit earlier this year, we did this great thing where we all talked in metaphors, and my metaphor was at war with generative AI, and Tim's metaphor was don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it was great. And Danny had a metaphor as well about snogging teenagers. If you want to see him put his hand in his head, to ask Danny about the snogging teenagers metaphor. But the point was, it was really interesting because afterwards somebody commented on LinkedIn, and they sort of did a review of the summit. And they said people often speak in metaphors at the beginning because they're trying to get that view that you're describing, right? They're trying to understand where it fits in the world and how to describe it and how to articulate it. And using metaphors helps us to start to think about those kinds of things. And so I think you're right. I think you're 100% right. I think we're at the point where we need to start breaking down that philosophical point of view. But I actually think there's some groundwork that we often do at the beginning where we all panic and we all sort of try and understand the scope of it all before we can get there. But you're probably right. We're probably at that point. That's Darren's prediction for 2025 is that we'll start to. His eyebrows went up there. He said, "Michael, don't yeah."
No, I mean, I can't wait for the singularity to come. But as Rena said, I think we need to think about how we interact with it. Think about the language. If we use an analogy that I'm thinking of is the Boston Dynamics video I watched recently, where all the guys are testing the robot by running up and kicking the robot and trying to push it over, and they're punching it and kicking it, and I think, well, is that really how we want to be testing robotics and AI in the future? Do we want to be kicking robot posties in the future, or do we want to punch a robot McDonald's worker or something like that? I think we should be, in all aspects of our society, we should be thinking about, well, we want to treat these things with respect and use language of respect and encourage that kind of interaction.
Interesting.
Oops. Okay, so guys, thank you so much. Michael, a huge thank you to you for coming along and presenting today, and for everyone for your questions. I will just stop the recording here now.